Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. I'm your host, Dave Markel, and this is episode 182. This week, it's a pleasure to bring back to the studio someone many of you already know, Cassie Nicholas. If you've heard her previous episodes, then you already understand the level of trauma she has endured and the strength it's taken for her to get where she is today. But what you're about to hear now, this is something different. A few weeks ago, Cassie reached out to me again. For a period of time, she had gone into hiding. She had trusted people who had told her they were going to help her get back on her feet. But what she came to realize was that those same people were actually trying to traffic her. Let that sink in. After everything she's already survived, she found herself right back in the crosshairs. But Cassie got out. And today, she's here to tell that story. What happened, how she recognized it, how she escaped, and what it's taken to keep moving forward without losing herself in the process. And what you're going to hear, more than anything, is not just survival, but a perspective on healing, resilience, and how to maintain a positive outlook even when life delivers things most of us couldn't begin to imagine. Here's Cassie. Hey, SAS listeners, I have a guest in the studio here with me today that hasn't been here for a while, and I'm really honored and thrilled that she's back. Cassie Nicholas is with me. She's going to bring us up to date on everything that's going on. Welcome, Cassie. I'm glad you're here.
Hi, Dave. Thanks for having me again.
Of course.
It has been, I was just checking the date today. It has been almost exactly 2 years. I recorded April of 2024 last.
Wow. That has been a while.
Yeah, for sure.
A lot has gone on. I know you've been all over, moving here, moving there, dealing with life. Fill us in. What's going on?
Well, there have been some good things. As you know, you don't even know everything that's happened
No,
yet.
we haven't even gotten a chance to get fully caught up.
There's a doozy of a story, and I do want to touch on that, but I also want to touch on the growth, because I disappeared for a year, just to let everyone know. Dave hadn't heard from me in a long time, and I finally got to a place. I was taking care of myself. I finally got to a place where I felt safe again, and I started reaching out to people, and I was like, Dave, hey, there was a year that was scary. But
yeah, and some silence time. I'm going to fill that in right there with me saying to my audience, I reached out to Cassie several times and never got responses, so I even started getting worried.
I had to change my phone number at some point too, and that's probably what happened. I do want to talk about that because there are important facets of that part of the story, but there's a lot of growth that has happened since then. There's a situation that I ended up in because, well, you'll see as I tell the story. So I think the last time I was here, I was in Utah. I drove down to your studio. It was fantastic to get to meet you. And I was dealing with some things like homelessness, still recovering from the domestic violence and that the sexual assaults as a child, the child trafficking had kind of set me up for as an adult. I was trying to avoid shelter still. But right after you and I spoke, after I came to the studio, my car blew up. And I was stranded in Utah, in southwestern Utah.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up in a DV shelter for a short period of time, and then flew back out to West Virginia for about 2 weeks. That's a whole long story that we don't need to get into. But I flew back out to West Virginia for 2 weeks. As you Dave, I'm sure you are very aware that people think that there are lots of resources out there for people. Like, I was finally surrendering to, okay, I need to go to a shelter after having been on the road for about 2 years at that point. I finally surrendered to that fact. But unfortunately, just because you're ready doesn't mean that there are spaces available for you in a shelter.
Right.
And so I was struggling to find a place to be while I was out in West Virginia. And there just, even with a personal contact, there just weren't openings. And so I ran across this group on social media, on TikTok, that was a mutual aid group. At least that's what they claim to be. Mutual aid, if you don't know, is like if you have a little extra money, you give to someone in need and vice versa. It is actually a beautiful concept. It can save lives. It can truly help people. However, there's a lot of grifting and a lot of scamming and a lot of danger out there. I have since then learned. This group that said that they were supporting me, and I want to pay attention to the kind of behavioral patterns, because I've taken a deep dive into cult psychology. I was born basically into a cult. As I've talked about, my high control religious background, my grandfather, backwoods of West Virginia, my grandfather was a
Yeah.
preacher. They did things like drink poison, handle poisonous snakes, just
Wow.
very
Scary
culty.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I already had disorganized attachment, and that's one of the main goals of any sort of abusive dynamic. If we're talking about a cult, if we're talking about a gang, a trafficking ring, or one-on-one interpersonal domestic violence, they want to engage disorganized attachment so that you are reliant upon them.
Hmm.
Resources, emotional support, all of it. And so I run across this group and they're like, yeah, we're doing mutual aid. But now I know that the red flag was that there was one particular woman who kind of was in charge of the mutual aid. That's not how it works. You should see results. You should see what the people are doing, what the
Hmm.
groups are doing. You should see results. There shouldn't be filtered through a single person. As I'm struggling out in Charleston, there's a moment where I think I'm going to have to sleep on the streets in the same city where I was trafficked as a child. Terrifying. They swoop in and say, would you like to come stay in Colorado? We have a campground off the grid. You can come stay for super cheap. We'll help you. We'll support you with a place to stay while you get back on your feet. It sounded too good to be true because it was. So they fly me out to Colorado, to the Western Slope, which is in the southwest part of Colorado, and everything seems fine. And because I have a degree in human behavior and because I just kind of study and am fascinated in the psychology of abuse and trauma, I started to pick up on the coercive control at first. I started to pick up on a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of promises with things like technology. Here, have a phone, be on our phone plan, it'll be cheaper for you. Lots of little things, food. They even had started to try to control food and my access to that as a resource. Unfortunately for them, I was raised by a woman who was from impoverished West Virginia, and I am resourceful as heck. I remember them coming over to the yurt where I was living several times and being like, how are you still eating? Poverty. It helped me out in this case. And so it turns out, long story short, this is a group that they actually have people throughout the United States because it is a social media scam. And they are not only a grift, this woman is filtering all of the financial or the mutual aid through herself, and she's cosplaying poverty. A lot of them are cosplaying poverty. She and several members of the group have had multiple nonprofits in their names. They have to keep reinventing themselves because people catch on to the fact that they're a grift. But they were also trafficking drugs, labor, and sex. And I nearly got trafficked again. They were working on it. Unfortunately for them also, I am one of the most stubborn people and innovative people that they've ever met. I was held hostage on a campground for a few months and I escaped to a hotel. I tried to call the FBI. It was 5 entities, 2 police departments, the FBI, the National Trafficking Hotline, and the Colorado Trafficking Hotline. No one would listen to me. The FBI hung up on me. In retrospect, I know that I sounded insane because what people do when they're abusive or looking to control you is they exploit your fears. They amplify them. And so I know there were parts that sounded crazy. I should not have been treated like that. 100%. The police were only concerned about any money that had been exchanged, but these people were doing this through things like Cash App and Venmo and
Uh,
claiming that they were donations. And so
mhm.
there was nothing they could do. So they didn't care if there wasn't money exchanged. So I was at my wit's end. I literally did not know what to do. They had given me a kitten to kind of lock me in. Again, they couldn't lock me in because I'm just stubborn. I was able to rehouse this kitten. I happened to escape to a motel and I went to the front desk and I said, hey, do you know any no-kill shelters? And the woman happened to be on the phone with her husband and they adopted her and
Oh,
she's
wow.
living a great life now. Then my kitten was gone and I had nothing. I was stranded in this place with no shelters, no nothing. It's very desolate down there on the Western Slope. I didn't know what to do and I still had my podcasting equipment at the time. And so I sat down, I started a new podcast. There's one episode and I recorded myself reading the letter that I was trying to give to the FBI, that they wouldn't listen to me. That's the only episode I ever recorded. I knew at that point, I was afraid that they were going to kill me because they had tried to do so already. And I'd had to take down all of my social media. That was why I disappeared. I took down my social media. I took down my podcasts, which were actually doing really well at the time. At that point, there was no proof that I existed anymore. And I knew that. And I thought I was going to be murdered. So I sat down, I recorded this podcast. I outlined what was happening. I said what I tried to tell the FBI just so that there was proof of my existence. I published it and I just left it there. And it's still there. I'm looking back at that and I am very proud of myself for being that resourceful to even think of that. After that was done, I still didn't know what to do. And somehow I came across, I'm going to get choked up talking about this, the phone number for a place called Kova that you know very well.
Yes, I do. I used to work for them.
Yes.
On a contract basis.
Right. And so in a Hail Mary, I reached out and I came into contact with the case manager who I got the pleasure of meeting recently. She was the first person, I think, to ever listen to me in a hectic situation like that, a person who could do something. The Polaris Project actually flew me out of Southern Colorado and into Denver. And I have been in Denver for the past just over a year at this point. And I have gotten some opportunities to speak for Kova. I had an opportunity to speak at the Capitol in Denver recently about a trafficking bill and the change to the language. That was the reason that I disappeared for a year.
Yeah, I'm going to throw this in real quick. COVA, for those who don't know, is the Colorado Organization for Victim Assistance. And they are based in Denver, but they are statewide, of course, because it is the Organization for Victim Assistance. I used to do training and presentations for them on domestic violence and sex assault. So that's why I know COVA, but I am so glad that you got connected with them. Tell us more.
Kova, like I said, they contacted the Polaris Project. The Polaris Project paid to fly me out because there was not even anywhere for me to go. It was so isolated, which again, let's refer back to the tenets of coercive control. One of the number one things that anyone's going to do, again, if it's an interpersonal relationship, if it's a gang, if it's a trafficking ring, they're going to isolate you. This was a very isolated location. I couldn't even get an Uber or a Lyft out of there. And so they managed to work it out. And when I went to Denver, I tried to do a trafficking recovery program. I'm trying to be careful about what I say about resources because I don't want to deter anyone from getting help if it works for them. My experience with the trafficking recovery programs has not been great. What they're doing is just reprogramming you to serve whatever cause they are. A lot of times it's very high control religions again. And I had identified that I wasn't interested in that. This group in Colorado was like, we're not religious based. We're just come as you are. And I went there and immediately they take your phone. You can't have your phone for something like 3 months.
Wait, what?
Right. This again, it's just they're doing the same thing that abusers have done to reprogram you for their
how do they get away with that? I mean, what if you were to say, no, you can't have my phone? What are you thinking?
You can't go to the program.
They just don't let you in the program.
Correct. They keep your phone, all of your electronics. You're not even allowed to use the internet.
Man.
It was kind of a nice little cleanse, if you will. However, it was ridiculous. I had a friend who I was afraid she has cancer, and I was afraid she was going to pass away while I was in the program. And they gave me permission to call her once a week. It didn't come to fruition, but I was allowed to call her once. And they had to sit there and listen to every word I said. And my friend, who is a master's level paralegal before she had cancer, she told me when I left the program, I got kicked out actually. When I left the program, she said, I was about to call the Colorado State Police because you sounded so fake on the phone. I had to leave her a voice message. She said, I've never heard you sound like that before. I could tell something was up. She said, I was afraid they were actually trafficking you. She does not react to situations like that. And so I'm not saying that they were trafficking people, but when I got there, I walk into where their office is. They would like bus us around in a little van every day all together. We weren't allowed to leave the house. We weren't allowed to have time to ourselves. And everything is religiously affiliated. And then the reason that I really wanted to go into a recovery program was for intensive therapy that I'd never gotten the opportunity to have. And they were all faith-based. psychologists or therapists. And I questioned them and they said, oh, well, it's fine. They have to pass standards and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yes, but it's still coming through a filter that I'm not comfortable with. And I let you know this up. And so, long story short, that didn't work out. When I asked to speak to the executive director of the program, they dropped me off at a no barrier shelter at the front door. I was lucky that they had beds. I was taken in. It seemed like the worst experience of my life. It seemed like I remained calm while I was in the car being dropped off, though. I knew what was happening. I've fought many battles, if anyone's listened to my story before. And Dave, you know personally, I'm a little bit of a rebel.
A little? Are you really? Really? Can we go there?
Shocker. I have a drive to protect humanity and to protect those who can't do it for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times that's why I fought the battles that I have. It's a spirit that my mother put into me. She was very much the same way. I grew up seeing her go to the library and check out books about marginalized communities from their perspectives. She was just constantly, even in West Virginia, in tiny little libraries, she wanted to know why. She wanted to know what people actually experience. I think that that's where that comes from. But with everything, there is a bit too far. And the experience with the cult, I was very much, I can see clearly now how I ended up in that situation, this cult trafficking ring. I understand it, but it's not like they onboard you and they say, hey, here's what we're going to do.
No, it's not like let's have an orientation about what it's going to be like for you.
Right.
Let me tell you how we're going to abuse you. They don't do that. They don't, for some reason they leave that out.
Yeah, I can't imagine why. They don't tell you that when you try to leave, they will ruin your life or murder you, maybe both. And so I can see very clearly, I was very, very angry about the system that is supposed to support people who have fallen on hard times. I was very passionate about the fact that survivors of sexual violence and survivors of things like child trafficking don't get societal support that they need. Nothing that I thought was wrong. However, I realize now that I was living in this hypothetical world. I was talking about these theories, again, that are not wrong. These are facts, but I never stopped to consider the fact that I still have to live in this world. I'd spent all of this time hypothesizing in the philosophical world about why the systems were broken. None of that was wrong. It still stands true. It's very true. We don't get enough support. However, I did not take into account or address the fact that I still have to exist in this world. And just because the systems are abusive, just because they're not supportive, doesn't mean that I can just sit down and say, no, I'm not going to participate. And so in many ways, the cult experience and even the shelter, which I will get into, ended up saving my life, not because of what they did to me, but because of the growth that I took from it and the resilience that I was able to gain from it. I see so clearly now how I ended up in that situation and someone preying upon me. And this is just a word of caution to anyone out there who is a survivor, specifically of sexual violence and or trafficking. I fully support people sharing their stories. It's very healing. It's very empowering. It can help someone else. However, be careful how you share your story, because me doing it on social media as a homeless woman who was traveling across the country by herself, it made me very, very vulnerable. I was also deconstructing my trauma and helping people, using my story to help others, which is great and admirable. And we should be able to do that. But unfortunately, again, we live in this world where there are real predators. And so what I was doing was giving people a roadmap to all of my cracks and all of my breaks and all of my triggers. They capitalized on that.
It sounds literally horrible, as if you had not been through enough horribleness in your life.
Absolutely. You've talked to me extensively many times. I've been on your show. This is the third time. You know how much healing I've done.
Yeah. I mean, you can sit there and talk about it. Being as transient as you have been, how have you done the healing that you've done? Can we talk about that for just a minute?
I love these questions and I love our conversations too, because that makes me step back and go, wait, how have I done it? My healing really started when I was homeless and someone told me that it was impossible for me to start a podcast because I didn't have a budget. And I was like, well, now I have to. Now I have to. You dared me. I am so stubborn. And so I
Wow.
bought a $10 mic from Five Below and I started my first podcast, which was called Appalachian Rising.
Mm-hmm.
And it got picked up in Europe and studied at a liberal arts school as part of a master's thesis, as being part of the Appalachian resistance to this like healing culture that can be toxic sometimes. But that experience, telling my story, that was the first step. It was the first time I had experienced emotions around it. I remember that the reason that I started that podcast was because I was mad, not just because someone told me I couldn't. I had just begun therapy with a trauma therapist, someone who actually, for the first time in 10 years of therapy, I came across a trauma therapist, and he, for 2 months, gave me so many tools that I needed to start to heal. There was validation, visibility. Wow. I felt seen, and my problems were being addressed appropriately. And so I was mad. I was like, I'm homeless now. I don't have an income. Why can I not heal? I'm the person who really needs these tools, these things. And so I reverted back to my degree that I have surrounding human behavior, my own personal research that I started doing on things like somatic healing. Right. I took a dive into just all sorts of different things. I've worked with the developmentally disabled for many, many, many years. That was my career. My sister was developmentally and intellectually disabled. So I'm very familiar with lots of sensory things and reconnecting the mind and the body. And as I started diving deeper into this research, I started learning about some of the science, some of just the spirituality that comes with healing. And just, I started attacking it from every facet. And that's what I was actually doing when I had to kind of disappear for a year because of that cult trafficking ring. I was working with people to make them personalized tools of healing. I'd have a conversation with them on video, Zoom or whatever. I'd get to know them. I'd learn about their learning style. I wouldn't tell them that I was doing all of this, obviously, because then it would be skewed results, but I'd learn about their learning style, what their interests were, what their passions were, what their creative abilities were. And I would make personalized tools for them, such as, like, for example, sometimes personalized guided visualizations or meditations I would read on my podcasting equipment for them. Sometimes it was just using items around you on the go and learning how to make it safe for you to address what you were feeling in your body and your emotions, so that then you could later and go to therapy and talk about it. I'm not a therapist, but I was helping people deal with the emotions and how it felt in their body. They could be safe. And by helping others, I was helping myself.
And we talked a lot about that too, that whole somatic experience of mind and body and feeling the feels. I think that's a critical aspect that a lot of people overlook in their healing process. So I think it's important that you brought that up, because those in the audience that may be looking at that, it's great to hear your take on all of that. In fact, I'll mention this now. There's a person that I'll be interviewing later today for this show whose specialty is somatic healing. So kind of be on the lookout for that episode. Her name is Sarah Perry, Perry.
And since I was experiencing poverty at the same time, let's look at the kind of new age spiritual community, for example, because they talk about healing a lot. I was mad because they'd say, you need this crystal or that crystal, and I had no money. And so I kind of actually went to my Appalachian roots, which said things like, for example, one of my favorite things that I did with someone, I was living in Utah in the DV shelter, and a woman came into the kitchen. She had a young boy. He was probably 3 or 4, and she was having a panic attack. And Cassie just happened to be sitting there in the kitchen. And I'm like, oh, good.
Of course, you're a magnet for panic attacks.
Right. And so the staff is like bringing her the EMDR paddles just to hold, but not giving her any instructions. It's just, there are things vibrating in her hands. And I'm like, wow, this is useless. And so I finally take a big sigh and I close the door and I just start talking to her and I help her through this panic attack. I give her ice to put on her chest. And at the end, she looks at me and with tears in her eyes, she says, I've been in therapy for a decade. I can actually walk away today, not curl up in a ball and fall asleep. I can actually take care of my son today. How has no one ever helped me do this? And I was just, working with all of her senses. I was breathing. I was using her mirror neurons. I was, I took care of it. And so later I thought, what?
Wow.
She was so grateful. And her son was neurodivergent. And I thought, what? I'm going to help her out. I'm going to give her some tools. And so I had this box of rocks. It was a box of different colored rocks that literally had just been dug out of the ground free, right? Because I'm poor. And so I put this box of rocks in front of her and I say, okay, I want you to pick out different rocks that represent different emotions for you. And so at first she's looking at these rocks and she's going, well, this black smooth one makes me happy, but it's black. Can that really represent happiness? And I said, I'm not going to tell you what to pick. I want you to pick it. And you could see she was a domestic violence survivor and you could see the timidness. And I remember being like that myself and being afraid to make a decision about even how you heal. And that's a lot of the problem with society is we're looking for people to tell us how to heal. And we're displacing the original wound, which was someone telling you how to live and how to exist.
Sure.
And I said, you pick out whatever rocks you want. And then I told her, practice, this black rock represents happiness. Sit and practice when you're not experiencing anything that's tumultuous. Practice visualizing the emotion of happy being in the rock. Visualize that going from your body into the rock. Feel the rock, look at the rock, notice what color it is, notice how heavy it is, and practice this. The next time you are having a panic attack, for example, pick the rock that represents panic or anger or whatever you're feeling. Pick it up and do this exercise that we just practiced. But I didn't stop there. I said, what if you're out in public and you don't have these rocks? Something else, pick a water bottle, anything. And so my goal in all of this and what I was doing when I was on that campground too, doing this to survive, was to empower people to make their own decisions about how they heal. I was presenting them with a tool that was adaptable and that they could use to pivot, that engaged all of their senses, that grounded them back into their bodies, that was free.
That is awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
It's exactly why I wanted you to be on this show again, as I knew you would bring value and education and importance to the listeners that are out there who've been through some of what you've been through, sometimes in a lot of interesting ways, and some who don't even realize they've experienced things that you may be now talking about, and they may have some aha moments. Oh, yeah, that's exactly what I just went through. And I've been ignoring it. It's kind of a hallmark of trauma is to try and divert your attention away from the trauma, to not acknowledge it, to deny and minimize the trauma so that your brain, your cognitive functioning can somehow get through it. It usually doesn't work.
Your body will remember it in the least.
Yeah. Let's go back a little bit to a previous episode that you said you have listened to. I want to talk some more about the shelter abuses that you became aware of. And I'm sure you were somewhat aware of it before, but one of my past guests, she lives in Arizona and she's a reserve police officer still, but she's also a trainer consultant. And her name is Nicole Florisi. One of the best episodes on shelter abuse being exposed and discussed is at my episode 99 with her. I don't want to rehash everything that's about. My listeners can go and listen to that if they want to hear more about what Nicole was dealing with. When this abuse in the shelter started, you weren't totally naive to that kind of thing, were you?
No, not at all. No, and so this was a no barrier shelter. And so I think that it's such a difficult thing to go ahead.
Define what you mean for those who don't know what a no barrier shelter is.
So no barrier shelter is often when you go to a shelter, you need things like an ID, a birth certificate. Some shelters do things like drug test. Those are the types of barriers that typically homeless people, particularly if they're living on the streets, don't have access to. And so no barrier means that you don't have to, no and low barrier means that you don't have to have access to those to get shelter in these places. And this is really difficult, this growth that I've done. It's sometimes difficult for me to talk about because my empathy has changed dramatically, and we'll get into it. It's changed and grown, I should say. Everyone deserves shelter. Everyone deserves to be safe. A lot of these no barrier shelters are the places where the most abuse exists because you're dealing with people with the most issues. As I said, a lot of people experience substance use disorder or severe mental illness. My entire life, you can tell from the other episodes how kind and empathetic I was. I saw people's wounds. I knew why they got there. I see how everything failed them, every person, every social support network. I saw it all. I understand why substance abuse happens, and I could relate to it. I could relate to it from the perspective that I was also just reliving these cycles until my dissociative amnesia lifted and I started making changes. And I know I was projecting my own growth and my own morality onto other people, but I was so soft and so kind. And it's unfortunate that you can't exist in the world like that because it's a gift to be vulnerable and to be that empathetic. I honestly had bad boundaries. I wanted to help everyone. And I didn't understand that in wanting to help everyone, I was also holding myself back in many ways. And so I go into the shelter, and I mean severe mental illnesses on the outskirts of Denver. Looking back, it's a trauma response that I didn't realize how dangerous of a situation it was.
Right. And I don't think that's a very common understanding in most lay persons' minds about what dangers lurk in shelters. It doesn't occur to them. It's not something that's talked about much.
Right. Let's talk about that just for a quick second. If you are specifically a trafficking survivor, it is so easy, particularly in a no barrier shelter, if you have someone on the outside who is following you or chasing you, or if someone just finds out that you're a trafficking survivor and you're already emotionally broken that way, it is so easy and not uncommon at all to send someone else into the shelter. Usually it's someone with substance abuse disorder that they can easily pay off with drugs and to get you trafficked again. Mm-hmm. And I did understand this. And so I used a fake name the entire time that I was staying there. They don't ask for a birth certificate. I was Charlie Noah. You know, that was actually kind of healing in itself, to go to a different place and have a different identity and just exist differently. I was such a kind heart. Because of my brief stay at the Utah DV shelter, I did know that I needed to move differently. And I had a roommate who kind of filled me in there. And so I did. I learned boundaries. I learned to tell people no. And the boundaries that I learned to set there were rather aggressive because you have to match energy, so to speak. You can't just say, oh, no, I don't think so. No, it's a firm no. You don't owe anyone an explanation. And while it is the way that I had to set boundaries there is not necessarily realistic in the real world, I feel like I'm often a pendulum and I go back and forth when I learn a new concept and I'm learning about healing through a new concept, and I go for it aggressively, and then later I learn the balance for it.
Mm-hmm. Which is a hard learn, especially if you are a nice person. Yes. It takes a thick skin to be in a shelter situation like that. And most people that go there don't have thick skins to begin with. But the unrealized aspect of this from when I first started learning about these types of abuses going on as a detective and investigating actual abuses going on in shelters was shocking to me because of my naivete and the newness I was to law enforcement in general. But then as a detective, being privy to so much inner workings and politics of these places, you encountered, like you said, some grift and some organized kind of things. But there's also the aspect of those people that are there that aren't organized, that are just bullies. They don't go into these shelters going, I'm going to bully people. It's that people are raised differently. People have different experiences. People have different traumas. And one of the things that a lot of people do in those situations is take control in whatever way they can. There is some organized aspects to it, but then there are those who are just bound and determined to control those around them. And I think that's kind of another aspect of this that we haven't mentioned that is equally as scary, because you can become property, more or less, without being trafficked. You can become that person's whipping boy, whipping woman, whipping girl, whatever. You're just there for them as the way they see it.
Yes, and you see something that happens in shelters also, and just by virtue of poverty, is enmeshment of all sorts. And in a place like a shelter, you see an enmeshment of resources. Someone doesn't have resources, whether that's a cigarette, whether that's a bus pass, whether that's your EBT and your food. There becomes, with your friend group or not, and at least an attempt to enmesh resources.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems, again, like you're helping someone because you know what it's like to have gone through this thing. But the sad thing is, in this world that we live in right now, that is built truly upon narcissism and psychopathy, you have to be a little bit narcissistic to exist successfully. And I don't mean narcissistic like super manipulative or anything, but you have to consider yourself and your own needs, because everybody else is doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not necessarily that it's, malevolence-based narcissism, but survival-based narcissism. And where it gets really messy is, as you were saying, when it does become organized, and when those who are in charge of the shelter are the perpetrators of that abuse. They survive on that. They thrive on it. They maintain their positions because of that political strength and power.
Unfortunately, the helping field attracts probably the most abusive people sometimes. I'm not saying everyone who works in therapy or everyone who works at a homeless shelter is a bad person. Not at all.
There are some really good shelters. There are.
Absolutely. However, these fields do tend to attract some predators because of the population that you're dealing with. You're dealing with already broken people. And I'm going to say that, and I'm also going to mention the fact that there is personal accountability. And I have learned that. That's one of the tough lessons that I've had to learn. Predators come into these spaces because of easy targets. And sometimes their predatory behavior isn't even intentional. Sometimes people just feel really bad about themselves. And when you can't control what's happening inside of yourself, and you don't have the tools or the knowledge or maybe the want to do better, you start to try to control other people. And I saw that happen a lot. And I stood up against it. I fought until my face was blue.
I want to go back to this. There are lots of really, really good shelters out there, lots of really good, helpful, beneficial advocacy centers and protection services and help, both financial, educational, and utilities and resources and computers and access to computers and just all kinds of really good community services for those who need it.
Especially in a city like Denver. There are so many opportunities and resources here. Just resource centers, places that'll serve you 2 meals a day or help you with bus passes when, the shelters fail to do so. There's case management available. Unfortunately, there are still barriers sometimes, like transportation or if you have a disability, things like that. But there are good resources. Your public library is a fantastic resource. I didn't know this before, but they have access to things like information about food banks. Like, your librarians know just about everything.
It's amazing. Even in little towns near where I am, I'm St. George, you wouldn't think I would have, this great library system, but they do. Yeah. And then there's a town just north of us you're somewhat familiar with, and that's Cedar City. And they've got some amazing services also. But all those things that you were listing includes job help. I mean, there's employers come to shelters looking for stable help. They can find it there a lot of times.
Use your resources for sure. Consider what is present and what you have to work with, but don't let someone else, even if it's a case manager, bully you into doing something that you know is going to be harmful for you mentally or physically. Not every resource out there is bad. Not every facility out there is bad.
Where does Cassie go from here?
That's a fun question, because I am a writer. I'm a very creative person. Dave knows.
She's an amazing writer. And storyteller and podcaster.
And I also studied photography. I have a whole photo series called Come Over to My House that chronicles
It's amazing. Yeah.
3.5 years of being homeless. So right now
Wow.
I'm actually working on a lot of different things, a lot of creative projects, because creativity truly is healing, because that's your inner child getting to come out and play. That's your inner child that was where the initial wound happened, where the initial trauma happened that keeps you repeating the same cycle over and over again. That's your inner child coming out to play.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about all art forms is, remember the cautionary story that I told you at the beginning of be careful how you share your story. Be careful that you don't put yourself in a more compromising position. With art, when you're expressing yourself through a creative outlet, you generally don't hand people exactly the pieces. You're not saying, here, this is exactly how you have to consume this. You're handing them, it's kind of like how I hand people tools of healing. You give them something, you present it to them, something that you've created, and you say, here, consume this as you will. And so it kind of puts a layer of protection between you and the consumer. But you're also processing and you're also healing. I don't care if you haven't drawn in 20 years, pick up a pencil and start drawing. You know, there is so much healing through art. I'm also doing writing. I've been sending in things that I've written to different contests and things. And so I'm working on a million different things right now to get back on my feet. And I will. And I am now more grounded in reality than I've ever been. I understand dangers more than I ever have. And I am on my way up. This is not going to be the next time you hear me, I'm going to have another tragic situation to talk about. And I would love, again, before we sign off, to read something for you. This is just about my experience at this homeless shelter. On the first night in the homeless shelter in Denver, Colorado, it felt like I had stumbled upon the most dire of possible fates. And at certain points in my life, that would have been true. But as time passed, I was surprised by the beauty and chaos that I encountered and eventually embraced in the form of difficult lessons, gritty wisdom, transformative growth, raw love, and unexpected connections, all the direct result of the worst possible outcomes. But as time passed, I was surprised by the beauty and chaos that I encountered and eventually embraced in the form of difficult lessons, gritty wisdom, transformative growth, raw love, and unexpected connections, all the direct result of the worst possible outcomes, so I thought. Sometimes you even forgot you were homeless. Sometimes the shelter felt more like a family and less like a city-run institution, even if that family was made up of mostly black sheep and crazies. But even with all of our faults and all of our strengths, even with our collective resilience in surviving the unthinkable over and over again, even with all of our anger and all of our wounds, we all shared one thing in common. We were looking for a home. In fact, most of us had been looking for a home our entire lives, but only a few of us truly understood the secret, that home was a place inside of each of us, and every one of us had our own story about how we had tried to find it and how that quest had led us to the Rocky Mountain State.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Amazing. And puts a whole new perspective on me, having been in that Rocky Mountain State. I think that term has multiple meanings, obviously. That Rocky Mountain State. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I like that.
It's amazing to have you back on the show and to listen to you share your golden nuggets of wisdom, which I love. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to say to anyone, lastly, who's out there and who's struggling and who is frustrated because they are repeating cycles and you think, oh my gosh, I've got it this time. You know, I understand the truth. I can psychoanalyze this. I'm good. I've broken a cycle, and you're frustrated because it happened again. I just want to say to you, don't give up. Don't give up. Human beings learn through experience. They learn through trial and error. I wanted to confirm, yes, you deserve more. You deserve better, but don't let yourself sit in that state for too long. Don't let yourself linger in healing for too long. Healing is constant. Don't give up. Believe in yourself. You know what's best for you. You have to also deal with what is present.
Excellent stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
We'll do it again soon.
Yes, let's.
I would love to have you back. That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to thank Cassie, not just for coming back, but for continuing to show up, to speak, and to trust this space with her story. Again, what stands out to me isn't just what she survived, it's how she chooses to live now. There's a clarity in her perspective, a refusal to let what's been done to her define what comes next. And that matters, because healing doesn't mean the past disappears. It means you find a way to carry it without letting it carry you. If Cassie's story impacted you, share it. These are the conversations that need to be heard, because they don't just raise awareness. They change how we respond, how we support, and how we understand. And they help normalize the conversation about rape and sexual assault to help bring justice to victims and survivors. Another powerful way to help accomplish this is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.